joined France in imposing a nighttime curfew. Switzerland has made face masks compulsory in indoor public spaces. The most drastic measures are in Wales in the United Kingdom. The government there has announced a strict 2-week lockdown beginning this Friday. Here's the First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford.
Between Friday, the 23rd of October and the 9th of November, everyone in Wales will be required to stay at home. This means working from home wherever that is possible. And the only exceptions will be critical workers and jobs where working from home is simply not possible. All non-essential retail, leisure, hospitality and tourism businesses will close.
All right, for more on this lockdown and the challenges facing European governments in dealing with the pandemic, I want to bring in our political correspondent, Emmanuel Schaz. She's here in Berlin. And the independent health analyst, Dr. John Campbell. He joins us from Carlisle in the UK. To both of you, good to see you. Dr. Campbell, let me start with you. The lockdown in Wales that they're introducing, it is very strict. It's going to be 2 weeks intensive. Do measures like this, targeted laser-like lockdowns, do they work?
We know that lockdowns work, Brent, because we saw it working when there was high cases in Italy and Spain and the UK in what we now call the first wave. So we know these measures are going to be effective. But the problem is Wales, of course, is only part of the United Kingdom. Relatively small population, only about 3.1 million people living in Wales compared to 66 million in the UK. And of course, it's not a firm border. The border is porous. Now, during this time of the lockdown, up until the 9th of November, there's going to be essentially a travel ban, almost a hard border between Wales and England. So things should be quite effective then. But then as soon as that period of time is finished, and we know that period of time is going to be time limited because it's called a fire break or a short, sharp shock. As soon as that period of time is finished, then it's going to be difficult to stop travel in and out of Wales again. So we could get this situation where, yes, the lockdown will work in Wales because people won't be mixing, but then are we going to get a rebound effect afterwards? A lot of countries have shown time and time again that countries that go together cohesively as a whole country, we think of Japan, we think of South Korea, tend to do better. And part of the problem in the UK now is we've got this disparate approach. We've got Manchester fighting London. We've got Scotland doing one thing. We've got Wales doing something else. We've got different parts of England doing different things. And we're not really moving forward as a whole country. So although it will work in the short term, although it will work locally, I'm not so sure about the longer term.
Do you think that the government of Boris Johnson should try to impose a lockdown for the entire country then?
It's actually very difficult at the moment because Scotland's got its own First Minister, Wales has got its own First Minister, London's got an executive mayor, Manchester's got an executive mayor, and the executive mayor in Manchester doesn't want to do what the government wants it to do. Now, ultimately, of course, the Boris Johnson government in London could impose that, but I think they're rather reluctant to do that because of this sort of subsidiarity we have in the UK at the moment, where there's different areas doing different things. You know, this pandemic has exposed a lot of weaknesses, perhaps in individuals, but also in political systems. And I think this weakness has been shown in the UK political system via this disparate approach that we're having at the moment.
Emma, let's talk about Germany. It has been struggling to find a national consensus on COVID-19 policy. Here is German Chancellor Angela Merkel in a video message that she delivered from this past weekend. Take a listen.
Please meet up with far fewer people, whether outside or at home. Refrain from any trips that aren't absolutely necessary, any celebrations that aren't absolutely necessary. Please, whenever possible, stay at home in your place of residence.
So, Emma, how do you explain this? Why is the Chancellor reduced, if you will, to issuing a direct appeal to the German people? Surely a clear national policy would be a more effective means here.
Well, yes, Brent, it would be, but we've seen that there are two difficulties here faced by the authorities in the current situation. First, because Germany is a federal state, well, all 16 regions have to come to an agreement when it comes to such restrictions. And after marathon negotiations last week, they managed partially to do so. They decided to limit the number of people allowed to meet in a closed space, to impose hour restrictions and an alcohol ban in bars and restaurants in risk zones, something that was already implemented in big cities that have been hit hard by the pandemic, such as the capital Berlin, such as Frankfurt. But those challenges is the second challenge is that those restrictions are sometimes being overturned by administrative courts throughout the country when those decide that they go too far, that the response of the authorities is disproportionate or unfair towards one sector, the hospitality branch, for example. And that's what we saw here in Berlin, for example, where the 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. curfew on restaurants and bars has been overturned for those of the bars and restaurants which lodged complaints. So it's very difficult to have a common policy in terms of restrictions, and it is very difficult for people to live in this uncertainty as well.
Yeah, and despite this confusion and this chaos, if you will, here in Germany, the country still seems to be faring better than its neighbors, doesn't it?
Well, there's a worry, if you will, that we're seeing an exponential growth of the number of infections and that it becomes out of control. Everybody is trying to avoid a second lockdown in favor of localized actions, localized answers, but it becomes increasingly difficult to contain the virus. That being said, indeed, with around 4,300 new infections daily, Germany still fares okay, especially if you compare it to neighboring countries. France, for example, can only dream about those numbers with more than 23,000 cases daily, or the Czech Republic, for example, peaked at more than 10,000 cases daily over the weekend.
And Dr. Campbell, before we run out of time, let me just ask you, you see Germans are struggling to get a clear message out to the people. What about there in the UK? Are the British people, are they getting a clear message from their leaders?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. The information is there, but very often people don't understand it. And I can really relate to that position in Germany, where you've got different parts of the UK having different regulations and people getting a bit confused between the two. You know, someone on one side of a river might have one set of regulations and someone on another side might have a different set of regulations. And as well as that, because they're changing all the time, it's difficult to follow. So I think most people have worked out the new regulations for Wales, what's going to be happening in Wales now. And we roughly know what's happening in the UK now with the different tiers, the tiers 1, 2 and 3. So people do roughly know where they are. But if you actually did a survey of the average person in the street, they probably wouldn't be able to tell you the regulations in great detail. But I think the messages are getting through, the key messages like the hand hygiene, the social distancing, the mask wearing, the limiting contacts between households. Those messages are getting through. There's a much better understanding of the principles of the pandemic, the principles of infection control, although the rules are so specific that people do get a bit confused with them, certainly.
Yeah, and of course the hope remains for a vaccine next year. Dr. John Campbell in the UK tonight, and my colleague Emmanuel Schaz here in Berlin. To both of you, thank you.
Thank you, Brent.
Thank you.